Well, it's great to be with you. And yeah, this is actually a really good problem to have to get an entire room that's full out and another room that's full in 5 minutes. So you're very cooperative compared to the average. And I'm always, when I'm at this conference, I think about the fact that a lot of you are high school and college and graduate students that are taking a chunk out of probably your classes have already started. And you came to Washington, D.C. to participate in the March for Life, and you stayed for the weekend for an entire day of programming and networking and listening to lectures, including lectures from philosophers at think tanks about these things. That makes you a non-representative sample of the population. But here's our challenge. The representative sample of the population does not fully appreciate what all of you in this room no doubt appreciate, which is the humanity of the unborn. That's the cause that has given fire and passion to the pro-life movement, certainly since its beginnings in 1973. It was triggered by a Supreme Court decision that led to a massive movement, not only nationally, but around the world. And then in 2022, we had the Dobbs decision, and those of us involved in the pro-life movement, what did we discover? That our fellow Americans were not nearly as pro-life as we had imagined them to be. And so we're at this moment where we're trying to say, okay, we're in the next phase of the pro-life movement. How do we get back where we imagined we were and beyond to the point that we all hope for, in which the taking of innocent unborn human lives is simply unthinkable, either in culture or in law? That's our dilemma. And so what I want to do in just a few minutes, I want to try to help you locate abortion historically and culturally in terms of the function it plays socially and so legally as an episode in the sexual revolution. Because I'm convinced at this point, honestly, I wish this were not true. There was a time when I thought, if we can just persuade people that unborn children are human beings, we'll win this. Because absolutely everyone knows that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. That is, everyone knows, people might disagree over whether some types of killing are justified or not, but everyone has a belief that murder is wrong in the sense that murder is unjust killing. So every human being with any kind of moral capacity at all, they don't have to believe in God. The atheist knows as well as anyone else, for instance, that it's wrong to torture children for the fun of it. Right? You don't have to be a Catholic, you don't have to be an evangelical, you don't have to believe in God to know that. And everyone walking the earth with any kind of moral sensibility knows and has a category of murder. Right? In other words, that there are some types of killing that are evil and unjust, and so ought to be prohibited. The laws ought to reflect that moral conviction. No one thinks, I really don't think there should be laws against murder. It's a very strange thing. There's a few kind of hardcore philosophers that might say that, a few anarchists, right, and sophomores in college in the dorm room or something. They say these kinds of things, right? They don't actually think that. They actually think there's lots of things we think might be wrong, right, like non-perjurous lying, that we would think that would be dumb to have a law against that because you can't enforce it. But if you're going to have a law against anything, it's going to be against murder. And so a lot of us thought, okay, look, we just need to persuade people of the humanity of the unborn, because it's hard to do that when people could not see what was happening inside the womb of a mother. Well, we now have HD footage of actual children in utero at virtually every stage of their development. There's a website called IRF where you can look at this. This is just a snapshot, as you can see. So this is a human fetus, which just means little one. That's a stage of human development. It's alive at 12 weeks of development. So 12 weeks from fertilization or implantation. Not sure how they're counting it. All right, so a lot of us thought, okay, look, once you can see that, so this isn't just sort of scratchy ultrasound that takes you 3 years of medical school to learn how to read, right? Because it's hard to see. It's on 3D ultrasound. That's an HD photograph of a human being in utero. Moreover, we know this from biology, right? Almost any embryology textbook will tell you that a unique human life begins at the moment of fertilization, in which you have a new organism, not just have a kind of unique DNA. You can have a bit of DNA that does nothing. You have an internally self-directed, internally integrated organism that develops internally on its own, right? It needs a context where it can do that makes it a unique organism. So it's not an organ of its mother. Right? So that's straight embryology. So here, if you're interested in philosophy, like this is what I did. I thought, well, gosh, the philosophy argument, the argument is pretty simple. Murder is wrong, premise one. Murder involves the unjust killing of innocent human beings, all right? 2, the unborn human being is a human being, an innocent human being. 3, it's wrong to kill an unborn human being. And then you add something like murder should be illegal, and you're there. This isn't really complicated. This isn't S5 modal logic or vector calculus, right? It's really simple stuff. Why does not that persuade more people? It's not because they're stupid. It's not because they're, on the wrong side of the intelligence distribution. It's because of something else. It's because abortion, legal abortion, abortion on demand, it fulfills a particular function at a particular time in history. It happened and became prevalent and was legalized by the Supreme Court because of something that we call the sexual revolution. Now, most of you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this. Now, I've got the picture of the sexual revolution. This is easy to find pictures online of to illustrate this, right? So this is not the sexual revolution as it began. This is sort of where it is circa 2023 or something, right? So you know what this is. But what is it exactly? If you were going to describe the sexual revolution exactly, how would you describe it? And now I've asked classes this before. I've asked people to try to describe it, and they will usually say something like this. The sexual revolution is about sort of elevating and holding up the pleasure of sex and sexual intercourse or sexual relations above everything else, something like that. Like you're putting too high of a priority on sex over other things. That's clearly wrong. That's not what it is. If that's what it is, we wouldn't be sterilizing children who are confused about their bodies in 2025. So whatever led to that was clearly not a overemphasis on the goodness of sexuality or sexual intercourse or something like that. It's something quite different. And so what I want you to think about instead, I'll propose what I think is the kind of the kernel, the acorn of the sexual revolution, the fundamental idea that then works its way out through history, both in our culture and in our literature and our self-understanding and in our laws. Ideas, they work their way through history. It's not like the process of deduction and logic. They work their way out sort of in a complicated way through the thinking and the activities of human beings. And so don't expect it to be this kind of tight deductive argument, but you can definitely see the sort of high points. So here's what I would maintain is the original sin or the acorn of the sexual revolution. It's the separation in our laws and in our thinking and in our tacit understanding of 3 things: marriage, sex, and childbirth. In other words, the idea that those things don't have to go together, ought not to go together, might be better if they don't always go together. Certainly, we should not imply, for instance, that, you should be married to have sex, or that just because you're married, it doesn't really have anything to do with children, or maybe that it's perfectly fine to have children and be single or not married, right? Sort of all those things. Or just simply the kind of vague assumption that those things don't really need to go together. But here's the problem, because that idea gained currency. Let's just say it gained currency in the 1960s. Everything that happened to give rise to it didn't happen in the 60s, but that's when it really exploded. All right? But something had to make that possible. It had to make it feasible. Because for most of history, if a culture just decided, okay, it's just going to be free sex for everyone, no constraints, it doesn't matter what the social context is in which people do this, go. What's going to happen, right, biologically? You're going to have a lot of children born out of wedlock, right? And just a little bit of social science is enough to teach you that children overwhelmingly do much better if they are born into and raised by their married mother and father. So that a culture that just simply ignores that, just kind of lets nature take its course, right, is probably not going to be long for this earth. That culture will probably ultimately get weeded out of the gene pool or beaten by cultures that understand how children ought to be raised better. Unless you had a technology that allowed it to be possible. And here's the other idea. If there's only two ideas that you remember from this. The first one is that this is what the sexual revolution is about, the fracturing or the splitting of these three realities. The second one is that usually intellectual revolutions also have some enabling technology that either allows it to spread or actually is a part of its essence. And so we're undergoing a revolution right now in the spreading of pornography that is enabled by the kind of disease vector of pornography, which is network and video technology. All right? It doesn't mean the technology is intrinsically bad. It means it couldn't have happened like it's happening without the technology in place. And then because ideas work their way into our laws, and courts are not made up of just these sort of dispassionate philosopher kings that, just sort of dispassionately decide the truth from on high. Like it or not, they also reflect the ambient culture. And so the things that, say, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land in the United States, the things they decide shape our understanding, but the cultural understanding, especially the elite understanding, also shapes the things that the court does. And so laws both reflect what we believe culturally and also shape what we believe culturally. There's a proverb, and it's something like this, that says, because murder is wrong, we hang men for it. And we know murder is wrong in part because we hang men for it. And so we both, people deserve to be hung, right? Or, obviously this is from the 19th century, right? You get this parable. But the idea is, well, we execute people for that. Well, because it's wrong. Well, how do you know it's wrong? Well, because we execute people for it. Yes, it's circular, but that's the way these things work. The courts are cultural institutions. Now, when Roe v. Wade happened in 1973, it was basically imposed by an elite cadre of thinkers on the culture. But 50 years of de facto unrestricted abortion affected the minds and the ideas of the culture as well. And so that's where we are now. So that's the sort of original sin of the Cultural Revolution. And now I want to just give you a sense of how it worked itself out. All right, so think of this, because it's really hard to get your mind around an idea moving through history. And I'm scared, you might be, if you've read any Hegel, I'm sorry if you have, that you might be thinking I'm making a Hegelian argument of an idea working its way through history. I'm not quite saying that. I'm saying that ideas work their way through us and our institutions. But let's make this concrete. Imagine the sexual revolution is a train trip. All right, and the train trip, you're on tracks, so it's moving you in a particular direction, and there's different stations along the way to your destination. And the train stops at every one of those stations, so you can stay on or you can get off every step. All right, so the originating train station of the sexual revolution, the place where we introduce into our culture the idea that sex, marriage, and childbirth don't need to go together, that's where we started. And so now let's kind of work that out. What would you expect maybe the next train station stop to be? Just think about it for a minute. If you're working, you're kind of imagining let's make this 1960, all right, or something like that. We're in 2025. We've gotten someplace from this idea working its way through our culture, and we're here now. What would be the train stops? Well, one is going to be the pill. Right, so there's been types of contraception or contraceptive behaviors for as long as there have been humans, but it was not until the approved birth control pill that this seemed at least plausibly to be technologically possible to have sex all you want right in the middle of the fertile years of your life without having to deal with the consequences, namely a baby. As President Obama referred to a baby one time, he wouldn't want his daughters to be punished with a baby. That's a channeling, right, of the kind of logic of the sexual revolution. But the pill makes this possible. And so whatever you think about the birth control pill or contraception or anything like that, there's absolutely no doubt that without this technology, the kind of original claim to separate sex, marriage, and childbirth would have been implausible And it would have struck people as really, really crazy and dangerous, because it would have been obvious that if everybody's doing that, we're going to have a lot of babies born out of wedlock. We're going to have a lot of poor babies. We're going to have a lot of poor women. This is just a terrible idea. But this sort of tantalizing idea, guess what? That's fine. Now, this is a weird kind of episode. This is why kind of everything happened at once in the 60s. So this was the first birth control pill was approved in 1960, not that widely used, because a few other things needed to happen. So Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, this was a Supreme Court decision of a Connecticut law. So believe it or not, for those of you that are millennials or Gen Zers, there was a time in which buying and using contraception was illegal in U.S. states, including blue states like Connecticut, right? And so this is a Supreme Court that was it was about whether married couples should be able to buy contraception. All right, and the Supreme Court decided it's a complicated case having to do with the right to privacy and stuff, that married couples should be able to have access to contraception. Now, you can guess that there were other states where it was already legal, but that's what this was about. Right now, you might have thought, okay, maybe a lot of you never even heard of Griswold or what it was. But this was what was happening was both a technological capacity to have something that was promised to be a kind of foolproof contraception, right? And then a cultural acceptance of the use of contraception ratified by a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. What you might not know, now if you're an Orthodox Catholic, you know this, because Orthodox Catholics have maintained this belief. If you're a Christian that's not Catholic, you may not know that this was just the Christian view of the matter until the 1930s. It wasn't a Catholic view, it was the Christian view. And it's only actually in the 20th century that there's been such fracturing on this point that it's now sort of seen as a quirky Catholic thing. This is generally understood because why? God told us to be fruitful and multiply. This seems to be actively sort of choosing to sort of break that, and so it seems like a bad idea. And so you could get people like John Calvin saying these kinds of things. Say it again? Yes, I know, I'm Catholic. That's why I say Catholics or other non-Catholic Christians. Yeah, so Protestants or Eastern Orthodox, but let's say so Catholics, Protestants, and Eastern Orthodox. Yes, I know Catholics are Christians. I'm one of them. All right, so you getting the idea here? Went the wrong way, sorry. All right, so you see we're moving. Different people got off the train at different places. So let's say Trinity Catholics, they didn't really take this trip very far, right? They got off way, way early. No-fault divorce? So anybody know who signed the first no-fault divorce law in the United States when it happened? Ronald Reagan is governor of California in 1969. So that was the first no-fault divorce law in the United States. And by 1977, a large number had passed no-fault divorce laws. 1983, all but 2. Believe it or not, New York and South Dakota were holdouts for some reason on no-fault divorce laws, and now all 50 states have it. Now, this just means that it's possible to get a divorce in that state without either party lodging fault for the other party. Now, there are kind of arguments that you can make in favor of this, but here's the kind of key thing, is that we decided as a country at the state level, which generally is in charge of marriage laws, that getting out of a marriage should be easier than getting out of a business contract. Because it's very hard to get out of a lot of business contracts if there's, if the details are right, without someone alleging fault. And that's a very, very strange thing to do. So this is, again, notice it's these kind of things you can make arguments one way or the other, but notice that every one of these is moving in a particular direction. And then Roe v. Wade in 1973. Now, that's the one we all know about, right? And most non-lawyers don't walk around with the names of Supreme Court cases in their heads or the year. But if you come to the March for Life, you know that, right? A lot of you may have not heard of any of these other decisions, but you've heard about that one. Now, why did that happen? Why did it happen when it happened? So remember I told you throughout the 1960s, certain things were happening, and there was the promise of a particular technological solution to prevent unwanted pregnancies, right? So the opportunity, the promise of free sex without children, is that what happened? No, that's not what happened at all. In fact, it so greatly increased out of wedlock sexual activity that it vastly increased the numbers of out of wedlock births as well. Even though there was a technology that, if used consistently, would presumably usually have prevented that, it so changed behavior that even with the presence of that technology, the problem persisted and in fact got worse. So now we've got a problem. We've got lots of children being born. And what do you do about that? Well, you know, if children weren't being conceived, you wouldn't have the problem. If they're conceived, there's sort of two choices, right? You either accept the consequences of that or you come up with something, a stopgap, which is abortion. And so when Roe v. Wade was passed at the time, abortion laws were sort of mixed around the country. And honestly, Americans had not even thought that much about abortion. So for instance, Catholics had a kind of detailed teaching on this, but Southern Baptists didn't. It actually took Southern Baptists a bit to sort of work through the logic of it. But long story short, the vast majority of Orthodox Christians got off the train somewhere around here. He said, look, whatever I might think about contraception or any of these other things, or Griswold, right? In fact, you probably didn't have an opinion about Griswold because you didn't know about it. You've realized the evil of abortion just simply based on what's involved, the killing of innocent, unborn human beings. But notice it happened in a moment, and it happened for a reason, and it fulfilled a particular social function, right? It solves a cultural problem from a set of ideas that have worked their way through our culture and our institutions. So do you see the point? Right? So it's fulfilling a function and solving a problem. As long as it continues to serve that function, or to be imagined to serve that function, for a majority of our fellow Americans, we are going to have a very hard time dislodging it from our laws and from our institutions and our customs. That's the difficulty. Now, that if we stopped there, how many minutes do I have? Maybe I do need to stop. No, we got a few more minutes. This would seem to be a story of despair, but it's not, because the train keeps going. Right? So we've got Roe v. Wade. There's a bunch of other stuff. This is obviously a kind of summary of a much longer train ride. So let's fast forward, right, to a new and fundamentally new reality, again empowered by a technology, free universal pornography. Now, the ruins of Pompeii, right, we have found pornography, that is sort of pornographic paintings on walls in the buried city of Pompeii. So there have been pornographic images since, there are probably some pornographic cave paintings for all I know. Should have Googled that. I might have had a good image for it, right? And you wouldn't be able to tell what it was, so it would be fine, right? Or it looked like a buffalo or something. But you get the point. You get the point. So I remember the first moment, I'm a Gen Xer, that I first saw pornography. It was in an alley. I was probably in the 5th grade, maybe. 6th grade, I don't remember exactly. It would have been in there, in an alley, just outside a dumpster, a very graphic magazine that was just laying open. And I know it wasn't like soft porn. It was pretty graphic. I mean, like anatomical stuff. And why do I remember it? Because it was utterly traumatizing. And I literally, for a couple of years, I remember I was actually trying to work out the anatomical details, which I didn't fully know at the time, right? That's kind of the normal reaction. And fortunately, I grew up before the availability of HD and now 4K real-time video pornography. The sort of strongest stuff you could get would be these still images that was very hard to get. If you went into a 7-Eleven, I grew up in Texas, if they even sold it, they had it behind the counter and it was covered up. So you just have to accidentally see it as a kid to be able to see it. Now, you have to be diligent not to see it, right? And the developers of pornography and the ways in which it is purveyed, the ways in which it is distributed, are designed to be increasingly addictive, and they are, right? Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want you to see how certain kinds of things, certain assumptions about what ought and ought not be allowed, what ought to lead to throwing people in jail and not, play a role in this. Now, I believe absolutely in the market economy. It's by far the best of the live alternatives. But a free market doesn't tell you what ought and ought not to be sold, right? The price function works if you're selling the kidneys of prisoners from China. The price function and supply and demand work if you're selling human beings as slaves. But we all agree that we shouldn't sell those. It should be illegal to sell those, right? Pornography is complicated in part because it's kind of a free expression thing, so it has this aspect of free speech. It's very, very hard to just actually prohibit entirely, even if we decided to. And even because there's such strong demand for it, there's always going to be someone somewhere in some jurisdiction they'll find a place to produce it because of the demand. And then the demand is addictive, right? There are lots of metaphors that I could have used. We could do Pandora's box, right? There's all sorts of things. This was a series of train stations probably, right? And actually, most people now, including Jonathan Haidt, who I think is an atheist and kind of left of center politically, realizes this is a catastrophe. This is a public health catastrophe of public mental health, especially for kids. Right? We all are familiar with neuroplasticity. We all have heard about the kinds of things that this technology can do. But here we are. This is the sexual revolution working its way out. All right, so I'll return to another Supreme Court decision, this time in 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges. So prior to 2015, 40 or 41, I think, states in the U.S. had marriage laws that specified what kind of arrangement qualified as marriage. And so for a long time in the United States, in order to be accepted as a state in the United States, your marriage laws needed to require monogamy. So in other words, two people. Now, in many cases, they didn't specify beyond that because it wasn't contested, like which two people, right? But suddenly, once it's contested, they've got really clear, okay, exactly one male and one female. So a marriage, to constitute a marriage as an institution that a state would recognize, so the states don't determine what these things are any more than they determine what we are, right? So a just and limited state recognizes our intrinsic rights in its laws. In the same way, if there's an institution called marriage, a just and limited state will recognize it and recognize what it is and how it differs from other institutions. And so 41 states had said to be a marriage, an institution and the sort of state recognizes this, needs to involve a man and a woman. Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015 by the Supreme Court said no. It violates equal protection, and it violates basically the freedom and the rights of people who have same-sex attraction and want to marry someone of the same sex. Now I want you to think about this for a minute. Where did they get that idea? First of all, what would have been the justification for defining marriage as intrinsically involving a man and a woman? Just think about it for a minute. What would justify that? I'm not going to call on anyone. I want to get your juices flowing. Because there's a philosophical argument here. It's fairly straightforward. Go back to the original sin. If marriage is the institution that sort of socially ratifies and recognizes and protects and reinforces a basic biological reality, an imperative, namely that it takes a fertile male and a fertile female, one of each, to mate, right? So that's a biological reality. That's the kind of minimal condition for naturally giving rise to another human being, is a conjugal act, that's what that means, between a fertile man and a fertile woman, right? Can give rise to another human. And there's a widespread assumption and intuition, now widely confirmed by social science, that all things being equal, the well-being of a child is enhanced dramatically if that child is raised by his or her married mother and father. So there's a state interest in recognizing and protecting and distinguishing this institution from, say, a Rotary Club voluntary association or a religious body or a medical license or a real estate license or a car title, right? That marriage, because it involves the bearing and the raising of children, it qualifies, right? It's a sort of rational basis for the state to recognize this. But what if the culture has already decided, both by its actions and assumptions for, say, 50 years, that those things need not go together, that marriage really, it doesn't intrinsically have anything to do with the bearing and the raising of children, and that sex doesn't have a particular characterization, right, that ought to take place in the context of marriage? Then the philosophical foundation for justifying and specifying that marriage involve a man and a woman is already gone culturally. So the Supreme Court in 2015 just essentially ratified that assumption that was already in the culture. So you see how a court can both shape public opinion and reflect public opinion, and then public opinion after the decision quickly changed so that large majorities of Americans who would have held this sort of traditional or natural view of marriage prior to 2015 changed their minds afterwards, in large part because the court ratified it. It just takes a lot of energy, to sort of resist that. And in fact, but the train didn't end here, right? So at every one of these places, people are getting off the train at different stations. Now, if you were old enough to remember 2015, the week after Obergefell was decided, the trans issue appeared. Magazine covers all around the country, from National Geographic and Glamour and Time, had pictures. In the case of National Geographic, a boy that was presenting as a female, I think just about an 8-year-old boy. But it was covers like this. Now, what does this have to do with same-sex marriage? Not really anything. I mean, now if you think about it, think about the ever-growing acronym LGBTQIA+. Thank goodness for plus, right? Because that's just the rest. L, G, and B presuppose the reality of biological sex. So L stands for lesbian. So what does that mean? It's a woman who is sexually attracted to other women. So it presupposes that women are a thing, all right? G, same thing. B, same thing. T does not. T actually denies that. It denies that there's this fundamental thing that we can observe in the world called sex, and there are two of them, two reproductive systems oriented around two gametes that, when fused, can produce another human being. All right, so you can see that at one level, these things are completely unrelated, but at another level, they sort of are. First of all, they were by the donors that had funded the same-sex marriage campaigns, who immediately pivoted to this issue. They would certainly be to anyone who was a sort of partisan of the final destruction of certain traditional institutions, such as the family. But in some ways, you could sort of think of it this way. Obergefell decided that the sexual binary did not matter for the institution of marriage. Gender ideology just says the sexual binary does not matter, period. That's the logic of it. Now, sort of legally, it hasn't been fully ratified. There was this case with Neil Gorsuch writing for the majority called Bostock, but it had to do with Title VII. It's a narrowly circumscribed rule having to do with employment law. It doesn't actually have the huge consequences that Obergefell did. It's also, I honestly think, kind of incoherent and not really going to be very stable. But again, it was like it's as far as the Supreme Court got. It's sort of on the way to the full thing. But then something else happened in that same year. A lot of us suddenly became aware of what the gender ideologues were doing to children. This is what activated me personally. So 2020 was a lockdown year, so I was a college professor at the time. Meant that I got to work from home, didn't have to wear pants, didn't have to shower, didn't have to shave, didn't shave for a year. Was really ticked about the lockdowns, and so a statistician and a biologist and I spent the time saved during the lockdowns writing a book. trashing the lockdowns and saying, making predictions about what a disaster they were going to be. And so I was working on this book feverishly, and strangely, my daughter, because she was a college student living at home because of lockdowns, was working for a publisher as a copy editor, the same publisher who was publishing my book. And she said, Dad, I'm copy editing the most unbelievable book. I can't believe it, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. I've got a non-disclosure agreement. I asked the publisher if I could get permission to read the manuscript, and I did, and my brain exploded. It was this book, Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier, a journalist in California that told the story in a very compelling way, for the first time, of what was happening to girls. That entire friend groups in California that were just perfectly fine one day, and then suddenly they come home and tell their parents they're non-binary the next and need to go to a gender clinic. We just learned yesterday that just in the last decade, the number of girls reporting with symptoms of gender dysphoria has gone up 50-fold, 50-fold, 50 times more than a decade ago. This is absolutely unbelievable. And then we started meeting detransitioners. These are kids, very often minors, who start their way down the transition path, right? Realize it's a terrible mistake and then either desist or detransition. And then 2 books last year by Mary Margaret Olahan and my friend Jennifer Lal here, both about the detransitioners. So Abigail Shrier told the story of what was happening to the girls. We're now far enough along that the victims are telling their stories. By the way, that makes this different from abortion. The primary victims of abortion very rarely live to tell about it. The detransitioners do. This is a different issue from everyone before. This train station is different from every other train station before. Remember, I told you the Roe v. Wade, that train station, it fulfilled a function. We can make good philosophical arguments about the humanity of the unborn, but people don't experience the moment of fertilization empirically and directly. Everyone experiences male and female. It's kind of one of the basic things that every child is expected to figure out by the time he or she's 5 or 6. I can remember this. I was a little kid in the 1970s when boys and girls both had long hair, and in the 1st grade, there were some kind of edge cases, and I wasn't sure. And I go to Cub Scouts, it's like, okay, boy. Right? I mean, we all do this. Every culture does this, and we all successfully, no matter our language or culture or religion, pick out the same people as boys and girls. So in other words, we're really good at it. So if this is a social construct, it's also an amazing global conspiracy because we always seem to get it right. That makes this different. Moreover, they directly came for our children because of a key feature of gender ideology is the sexualization of children. And the reason is precisely because of this point. If you have an ideology that wants people to deny that the basic biology of male and female is merely assigned at birth, you've got to get people when they're very, very young. Right? Before those neural pathways just kind of have a way of digging in, it's very hard to uproot them. And so that's why the gender ideologues spend so much time with curricular material for small children, including explicitly pornographic graphic novels and catechetical aids like my very favorite, The Gender Unicorn. I say my very favorite because in one image, which you can spend an hour exegeting, you get the kind of concretized form of gender ideology that's taught to small children. All right, so normally we would, you might try to help kids when they're young, boys and girls, and you don't talk too much about anatomy ideally, but you get this idea that they're different in certain ways, so you separate the sports, you separate the bathrooms and things like that. The Gender Unicorn is designed to make sure you do not do that. Right, so obviously it's designed for kids, so just have a look at it here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But the idea is to get kids thinking not in terms of sex and biology, but in terms of this thing called gender, which is itself a complicated story that most people still treat as if it's a synonym for sex. Academics and specialists have been using it to mean something different for a few decades, but it now is a stand-in for an idea called gender identity. And so have a look here. The idea is to teach kids that people have these different gendered aspects of themselves, but gender has to get detached from bodies and sexes. And so you have this thing called a gender identity, which is this internal sense of gender represented by the rainbow, right? You've got gender expression. It can be feminine, masculine, or other. You've got the physical and emotional attraction. Notice you've got, it looks like 3 options, except that the lines, right, they don't have any sort of, there are no dash marks on them. So it's a kind of an infinite spectrum of variation. All right, and then right in the middle, I want you to notice, because you might think it's preserving biology because there's this DNA molecule. You see what it says? Sex assigned at birth. That's gender ideology in a nutshell. The reality of sex is a biological fact, right, rooted in our natures that can almost always just be observed, and in very rare cases maybe requires a little clinical analysis to figure it out, right? That's gone completely. There is no sex, there is no biology. There is an internal subjective sense of gender called a gender identity. Notice that's circular. That's supposed to be that way. And a social construct called sex assigned at birth. All right, when people, I can tell you as a father of daughters, understand what is happening, and they started understanding in 2020 because the lockdowns and the Zoom classes gave moms in particular a front row seat at what was happening. They got kind of mad. And I don't honestly think the gender ideologues realized they were awaking not just one sleeping giant, but millions of sleeping giants, because they were coming between children and their mothers, and they did not reckon with that. And this is what we got at this train station. This is what the train station looks like. It's a mass exit of people wanting off this train. People who are partisans in favor of same-sex marriage, people who had been pro-choice their whole lives, people who thought free sex was great, people who had never spent 2 seconds thinking about the original sin of the sexual revolution, saw Rachel Levin and big old Leah Thomas standing next to Riley Gaines and said, this is insane. I don't know what's happening, but it's evil and crazy, and we've got to put a stop to it. And in the last 4 years, half of US states have prohibited these medical experiments with children. They're passing laws to prevent males from going into women's prisons. And then lo and behold, for those of us working on it, just a few days ago, we got an executive order that just insisted on all this in one fell swoop, and it's now going to be forced through the federal bureaucracies. Never seen anything like this. It's amazing. Yes, absolutely. It's unbelievable. Now, what is my point? This is where I've been, by the way. I actually switched jobs. I was a college professor. I moved to the Heritage Foundation, honestly, to get into this fight because it was making me crazy. And I thought, I think we could win this one. This isn't going to be like the others, but I can tell you 3 years ago, the most Republican staffers thought, oh no, this is going to be like same-sex marriage. This is going to be like abortion. Oh, this is a big loser. Yeah, this is how they were acting. They eventually figured out it was a big winner, and because the people that, wanted them to fight would not take no for an answer. And then they realized, finally did some polling and discovered that even in California, a majority of people, including a majority of Democrats, seem to think secret social transitioning and gender surgery for minors and boys and girls sports was a bad idea, all right? It's weird that it was partisan because it wasn't like the Democratic Party was listening to its base. It was listening to the radical activists who were pushing this stuff, and they likely lost a national election because of it. But here's where we are. It's not the last place, though. There's one more stop, and it's dissolving the age of consent, which is what this has been about all along. If you read the queer theorists, they will tell you this, right? That the distinction between minors and adults is arbitrary, and that insisting that children can't have sex with adults is denying the sexual freedom and agency of children. And think about it. If you can convince kids that there are no boys and girls out there in reality, it's going to be way easier to convince them there are no adults and children, because the truth of the matter is, it is a spectrum, right? Like somebody that's a day before their 18th birthday is different from somebody that's 9 years old. And so they could capitalize on the sort of haziness of that. And that is exactly what they want to do, is lower the age of consent until the age of consent simply does not matter. And I can tell you, all those people getting off the train, right, in the previous stop, they see where that's going, a lot of them, and they absolutely don't want to be on that. And then what do you get? Well, you get something like this, right? A culture that countenances that is ultimately going to be a culture that dies. And people generally don't want to be part of a cultural campaign of cultural annihilation. And that is an opportunity for pro-lifers, because this is where we are at the moment. We are in a really crowded train station with atheist evolutionary biologists and people who identify as lesbian and former leftists and current leftists that can't understand what happened to their party, and just a lot of really upset parents that aren't all that political, but they know something really serious has gone wrong in our culture, and they know it has something to do with children, and it has something to do with sex, and it has something to do with the law. These people are open to conversations that the same people were not open to 5 years ago. That is an opportunity for us. Now, it's going to require strategy and careful thinking and rhetorical depth and sophistication, but we need to learn how to have conversations with these people who know that the gender thing didn't drop out of nowhere, right? It happened at the end of a long course of historical and legal changes, but they're not quite ready to think through the implications all at once. So don't spring Griswold on them right away, all right? That's my advice. Don't start there. Work your way back, all right? Because this is who we ultimately want to protect, but to protect them, we need to think about them in the context of the institution of the family and the destruction of the family as a result of the sexual revolution. I'm convinced when we do that and can persuade our fellow Americans about what's happened, that we can end the scourge of abortion. Thank you very much.